Hello, this
Hello,
is the
this is
Stories
Storybooks
Beside
channel.
channel.
New
I
videos
release
are posted
videos
every day.
for you.
Subscribe and click the bell.
Michael looked at the bottom right corner of the laptop, where the date and time were located. He was startled when he saw that he was disastrously late. He rose hastily from his desk, but immediately sat back in the leather chair with a loud exhalation. He covered his eyes, trying to cope with the sudden surroundings and the darkness that clouded his vision. He cursed unhappily to himself. Michael had been catching himself more and more often lately with his health problems. Fatigue was bothering the young man, and it was piling up. Pains of shortness of breath, which appeared even after a seemingly small load. For example, if he easily ran to the 5th floor of the office, ignoring the elevator, but now this march up the stairs gave him a much worse condition. His acquaintances and colleagues began to notice him. And of course, relatives walked frighteningly pale, tired. Not himself. He looked like a ghost, but he didn't rush to the doctor because he diagnosed himself as a workaholic. Yes, the man worked hard. He could skip meals without feeling hungry because he was so busy and constantly working. He hardly ever took a day off either. Michael also did not sleep much. He was well aware that 8 hours was the recommended norm for a healthy sleep. However, he was inspired by the stories of past successful people who had slept much less and who had achieved greatness. For example, the Roman politician and General Gaius Julius Caesar, who founded the great Roman Empire. He only slept 3 hours a night. He would have achieved this result if he had slept 8 hours. It is unlikely that Leonardo da Vinci, the brilliant artist and inventor, if we believe the historians, slept a total of 2 hours a day, working the remaining 22. And Napoleon was not far behind. He slept 4 hours and claimed that only sick people slept 9 hours a night. Michael didn't count himself among the sick. He wanted to be among the geniuses. At that time, he was alarmingly pointed out by people who cared about him. They hinted that the man was not Julius Caesar and would drive himself into the coffin. He only made jokes in his own way. "I'll sleep in the other world," he waved. Michael with a carefree smile. No time for sleep when great things await us, except that at that moment, the man had no idea how close he would come to the other world with such predictions. Now he sat in his office, unable to get up and go to a business meeting. "I guess you have to sleep sometime after all," the man muttered aloud, still not daring to raise his eyelids. He touched his temples with cool fingers, hoping to give himself some relief. His condition, which is that a man even in times of ill health or illness goes to work. There was a simple explanation. Michael had not long ago inherited his father's company. He wanted to live up to the trust of his parent, who had put his heart and health not only into raising a decent heir, but also into the enterprise. His father, Ethan, was the founder and owner of the Farm and Clothing Company, which owned a number of popular clothing brands. But it was now that the business was booming. Before, their family had nothing. The success story could be a role model and inspiration for business exploits for today's entrepreneurs. Ethan came from a simple family. His father worked as a locksmith, and his mother was a cook in the school cafeteria. When Ethan was 10 years old, the family had a grief. They lost their father. The man's heart failed. So began a new period of their life. The period was difficult. There was very little money. The boy could not watch his mother work alone. He was brought up as a man who should be a support and a pillar. So he started working part-time, and already at the age of 12, he was delivering newspapers to mailboxes, offered to wash cars, carried boxes of vegetables in stalls. In general, not bored any work. When Ethan went to 8th grade, he was lucky acquaintance managed to get a place in a clothing store where the clothes were sewn for the rich clients. Mostly the teenager was busy running around as a messenger on various errands. However, the work attracted him. After only 2 years, he decided to try his hand as an apprentice to a fashion designer. He avidly adopted the experience of craftsmanship and also looked at the structure of the business from the inside. It was during that period that the idea of a future business was born in the young man's soul. However, The main motivation in his career was love. Ethan met Adriana when he was 18 years old. It was Adriana who supported all his ideas, in word and deed. They got married at the age of 20. It took just a year after the wedding, when they decided to open their own knitting factory. True, the enterprise was a family enterprise, very small. At first, Ethan and his mother and wife sewed their own clothes and underwear to order in their own living room. It was difficult and inconvenient, but the result was worth it. Their partner turned out to be unreliable, and at the last moment he refused to buy a large batch of already sewn clothes. Then the couple, on second thoughts, decided to sell the goods themselves. To this end, they opened their first small store. To their amazement, the store sold out as quickly as fresh cakes at the local market. One store later evolved into a chain, and then the brand grew into a corporation. Knowing the history of Farman's brand development, Ethan, Michael's son, once at the helm, simply could not let this ship of branded clothing sink. Michael knew from a young age that he would be the heir to the company, but it wasn't a burden on him. He loved his parents' brainchild with all his soul. As a high school student, Michael helped his father keep up with the times by bringing Farman into the world of the internet. Later, they took Farman overseas. Unfortunately, the market was now filled with new brands and clothing that were popping up like mushrooms after the rain. There were many competitors. There was no time to rest. So Michael was exhausted and worked hard to improve the enterprise. For example, he now wanted to offer customers clothes made of environmentally friendly materials in a natural style. He planned to use organic cotton for this purpose. He believed that the organic trend would help the firm reach great heights. Only Michael didn't know that instead of a business meeting, he would end up in a doctor's office. Michael did not immediately open his eyes, feeling as if his eyelids were filled with lead. The dull pain in his head was also growing in his chest. Something was stirring uneasily. He opened the top drawer of his desk and fumbled for a cardboard packet of painkillers. However, when he took it out, he found that it was empty. Great, just great, Michael grumbled, dumping the packet into the paper garbage can, having no better alternative. He picked up a half-empty bottle of water and took a few sips. Relief did not come, but he had no choice. Time was running out, making the punctual businessman even more nervous. Gathering his strength, the man stood up from his chair, picked up the necessary papers. Michael headed for the exit from the office, but he did not even have time to touch the door handle. The world in front of him twisted and rapidly plunged his consciousness into chaos. Michael did not even realize what was happening to him. He collapsed on the floor unconscious. When he lifted his eyelids, a bright light hit his eyes. The unpleasant smell of alcohol and sterility hit his nostrils at once. His left arm ached. The back of his head, too. Michael groaned at the discomfort, attracting the attention of the young woman sitting next to his bunk. It was his fiancée, Betty. "Honey, are you awake? God, I was so worried. Wait. I'll get the doctor now." The gorgeous blonde. At first she rushed to Michael, but then she rushed the other way to the exit. Michael didn't have the strength to stop her and demand an explanation. Within a couple of minutes, a nurse and a doctor entered the room. The doctor looked at the patient while the nurse was changing the solution in the IV. "Michael, glad to have you back with us." The doctor smiled. "My name is William. How are you feeling?" "You can just call me Michael." "I feel confused," Michael admitted with a furrowed brow. "I don't understand what happened. How did I end up in a hospital bed in the first place?" "Your secretary found you on the office floor." Betty interjected. "She called an ambulance. Then she called me. You passed out." It must have been the lack of sleep that embarrassed the man. Except the doctor shook his head. "Unfortunately, the cause of your condition is much more serious," he said. "I do not want to jump to conclusions or scare you, but my prognosis is not favorable. I'll be able to tell you more accurately when we conduct the necessary examinations. I don't have time for that," Michael began, but the doctor interrupted him. "No one has time for doctors," William frowned. "Only when do you find it? Sometimes it is too late. I insist on hospitalization and a full examination, Michael." The man raised his eyes to the doctor, thinking to saddle him. There was no need to make a big deal out of the situation. So he fainted. It doesn't happen. Only when Michael met the medic's gaze did he feel his gravity and seriousness. The doctor wasn't joking. He was concerned about the patient's condition. His anxiety was transmitted to Michael, even if just a little. The parents were worried when they heard about their son's condition. So Michael was forced to put aside his business deals and contracts in order to focus on his own health. From that day on, everything spun a string of medical offices, examinations, tests. A cardiologist prescribed a lot of tests for the man. As a result, Michael was diagnosed with the most severe myocardial pathology. At the same time, the disease rapidly progressed. After another examination, the doctors rendered the verdict: "You have a cardiac insufficiency. This is a dangerous pathology which leads to death." What Michael felt when he heard his diagnosis, he simply didn't believe it. Surely there must be some mistake. The man said calmly, "The heart disease is fatal." "Really? I'm not an old man, some kind of doctor." Michael smiled. He wasn't angry at the doctor. Of course, doctors are human too. They make mistakes. But Michael couldn't be terminally ill. That's ridiculous. He was young. He had his whole life ahead of him. The guy had just inherited his father's company. The new business owner had a lot of ideas, energy, and of course, health. He used to go to the swimming pool and the gym, so he always stayed in shape. Yes, perhaps he did have a lot of coffee and a bad habit of smoking. But who doesn't do that nowadays? Only the doctor looked at the man with pity, like a drowning man grasping at straws. Unfortunately, there is no mistake. We do not pronounce such diagnoses unless there is a 100% certainty. Michael calmly and firmly explained the doctor. Okay, Michael nodded hesitantly. But this is treatable. We live in the 21st century. We will soon have robots working instead of people. I think drugs, that is, some therapies in Israel and Germany. I have enough money for any kind of treatment. Unfortunately, medication will no longer be effective. Your condition is getting steadily worse. The only thing that can help you is a heart transplant, the doctor said categorically. In Michael's mind, his words sounded like the blow of a referee's hammer on a coaster. It was they that became the verdict, not the donor's diagnosis. The heart of a stranger's heart that should have saved his life. That's what frightened Michael. He rubbed his face with his palms with effort, trying to come to his senses. His head ached again, this time from the heavy thoughts that filled it, like the buzzing bees of a beehive. But how? Why? How could this have happened? Michael was astonished. I had always led a healthy lifestyle. Okay, I admit I smoke. I can drink, have fun on the weekends. Nothing criminal. I've been friends with sports since I was a kid. Never had any restrictions from doctors. Couldn't you see that before? All situations and people are individual. Unfortunately, heart diseases are getting younger every year. Therefore, even young, healthy people like you are not immune from such ailments. Unfortunately, explained the doctor. In your case, could it be due to heredity? Your grandfather died of the same disease at a relatively young age, but I didn't feel any problems before. Michael was indignant. It all started quite recently. Some diseases are called silent killers. They don't make themselves known until it's too late, the doctor patiently explained. Your disease may have been lurking, but now it is progressing. It may have been caused by an infection you had. Your mother told me that you were very sick recently, but that you were still working. By the way, your habit of getting sick on your feet and working hard has also contributed to your health condition. You will have to change your lifestyle, eliminate stress loads. You'll have to go on a diet. Michael shook his head, trying to come to terms with the new reality. At that second, he became acutely aware that money was just paper, because having a bank account didn't save the man from a terrible diagnosis or even dependence on the mercy of fate. After all, buying a heart is not like going to the market for vegetables. How long will I wait for a donor heart, doctor? Michael was confused, gradually realizing that there wasn't much time left for the motor in his chest. Isn't there any other way? Either a transplant or a miracle will help you. The doctor threw up his hands. But I'm not a magician. I'm a cardiac surgeon, so I'll help in any way I can. Michael was put on a waiting list, which stretched for many long months. It seems like 10 months in a person's life is a drop in the ocean. Not when there's a bomb beating in your chest, ready to terminate your life at any moment. Every day, Michael lived in hope that today he would get a phone call telling him that a donor organ had been found. After all, he was absolutely not ready to say goodbye to life. Betty, though, insisted on speeding up the process and just buying an organ through a transplant clinic. "We have the money, Michael," she said, with her pouty lips pressed together. "Why are you standing in line like you don't have any?" Michael shrugged his shoulders. Yes, there was money. He was, admittedly, finding out about buying an organ himself. Turns out, the modern world is such that everything is bought and sold, even when it comes to the human heart. This issue was regulated by law. There were many pitfalls, but buying a heart was realistic. Only Michael couldn't. Something inside him resisted. It told him to wait in line humbly and patiently, to live in hope just as others lived, to buy a donor heart, to buy someone else's life. Echo, he asked the bride again. It even sounds kind of wild. Blood donor. Okay, bone marrow. Okay, but a heart. I mean, there's no real volunteers to give a heart, right? You need it for yourself. I don't understand. Looking at Michael at a loss, Betty said, "Why are you saying all this?" "Because my hope of survival is a kind of sin. Because if I want to survive, I have to hope that someone will die. Someone will die in an accident. Someone will fall into a coma, or something else will leak me their heart, and they will fade into oblivion, leave their close parents and children." Betty lifted her beautiful lips again, looking utterly displeased. "You won't even know the man's name. What do you care?" "It bothers me too," Michael said thoughtfully, "that I won't know the name of the man who saved my life." And so the days passed. They dragged on slowly, like gum stuck to the sole of a shoe. The hardest part was my mother. She couldn't help her emotions. Every time she saw her son, she tried to smile, to rejoice, but then she said goodbye to her child. As if for the last time, she began to cry, pressed her son to her breast. "Everything will be all right." Michael smiled, stroking his mother's trembling shoulders. He sincerely believed in what he was saying. Thursday was a very rainy day. In fact, it had been raining in their city all week, turning the streets into a parody of the canals of Venice. Except it wasn't gondolas, it was cars, spilling water all around them. Michael received a call on his phone that divided his life into before and after. Michael was told that a suitable donor organ had been found. Happiness swept over the whole family. However, the excitement felt greater. Michael himself was not worried. He was sure everything would go well, and he had nothing to lose. His premonition didn't let him down. The operation lasted for 8 hours and went without complications. The man woke up with a new heart, and it worked properly in his chest. The organ was absolutely healthy and full of strength. The days after the surgery were hard. Michael felt as if he had fallen into childhood, that helpless state that infants are in. He even jokingly referred to himself as Benjamin Button, a character from his favorite movie. It was as if Michael was both an adult and a child at the same time. It was as if he was learning to live again. Sometime after the transplant, Michael was allowed to watch TV and read a little. He was discharged after about a month. Then he was in home rehabilitation for another month. Each day, Michael's condition got better and better, and soon the disease and the fear of dying seemed to be something far away, as if from another life. However, he really started a new life, because in his chest, a new heart was beating. 3 months had passed since the operation. Michael felt fine. The only thing that bothered him was the name of his savior. Thoughts of that name haunted him. It was as painful to him as the illness had been to his heart. His condition was noticed by his best friend, Liam. He visited him once again. He asked why you were so gloomy, Michael. I understand. You're unhappy that we're not meeting for a glass of whiskey, as usual, but freshly squeezed juice. On a Friday night, the man grinned and raised his glass of bright orange liquid. Believe me, buddy, I'm not thrilled with what I'm drinking either. By the way, it's pumpkin and carrot. Michael seemed to squint. You're still lucky they made me drink beet. It's good for the blood vessels. Liam shook his head sympathetically. No, seriously, what are you worried about company? Asked a friend. Noah and Betty seemed to be doing fine. Michael sighed. Yes, he was worried about the company. He wasn't used to delegating his responsibilities. His deputy Noah and fiancé were now in business. He wasn't even allowed to get into business, so he wouldn't be nervous and avoid stress. That wasn't what Michael was worried about. You know, I decided from the very first day of my heart transplant that I wanted to learn about the donor's family. Not just to learn about them, but to go to them, to thank those people, to tell them how grateful I was for the chance their relative gave me. Maybe help financially. I don't know. Do you think that's a good idea? A friend asked thoughtfully. Not everyone will be happy if a man comes to them and says, hello, I have the organ of your husband, brother, son of a matchmaker in my chest. Not for nothing are kept secret. Are you right? I guess, Michael nodded, looking at his own glass of juice, which he hasn't touched yet, that if they need help, they've lost a loved one, possibly the breadwinner. Okay, but how do you know the name of the donor? As far as I know, doctors are not allowed to divulge that information. It's confidential. It's against the law. I heard somewhere that there's a memorandum on finding out the name of the donor. A year. You're right again. But I want to at least try to find them right now, especially since you can find out anything you want for money. You see, I feel like I have to find them. I have to. It's like my heart is begging and leading me. I wake up at night and I feel it beating and tearing somewhere. Sounds silly, doesn't it? It's like I'm a character in some soap opera. Liam was pensive and shook his head. You know, when you got sick, I got interested in this whole thing about hearts and transplants. So I found out that Rockefeller bought himself 5 or 6 hearts. Ended up living over 100 years. Heard in passing, nodded Michael, who was into reading biographies, famous personalities. So, nothing. It wasn't about him. I just read about cases where people have adopted the habits of their donors. For example, one woman who before surgery did not drink alcohol and hated fast food. After the transplant, she wanted a can of beer and chicken, and she also embraced musical tastes. At first she liked classical, and then she liked rap. Turns out the donor was a guy, a student who had crashed his motorcycle. He liked beer, listened to rap music, and loved fried chicken. There are a lot of cases like this. One worker who got a violinist heart loved classical music, and the guy who got a drowning man's heart transplant was terrified of bodies of water. And you lead with the point that my new heart also requires meeting the donor's loved ones. Correctly understood his friend, smiling. Well, you never know what your heart wants. There was a case where a man married a donor's widow because his heart loved her. Michael jumped with laughter. You know, I reminded myself of a hero, a melodrama, or a Brazilian TV series. But you outdid me. Liam poked his friend in the shoulder with his fist. Don't tell Betty that I have someone else in my heart. She'll find a rival before I do and eliminate her. Oh, you're being mean, waved his friend, and then took a generous sip of juice and grimaced at its taste. I'm trying to be supportive, by the way. Though Michael chuckled, he listened to his friend's theory. He did not dismiss his idea. Finding the right information was not so difficult. True, it did not come cheap. After all, Michael had the name of a donor. His name was Jacob. When Michael received the letter, his heart began to race in his chest. It turned out that his savior was a young man Michael's age. He had been in an accident on one of those rainy days when the roads were slippery. His heart matched Michael's so perfectly that even the doctors were shocked. The man's voice trembled with overflowing feelings. "I'm sorry, Jacob, that you died, but all the same, thank you," said Michael aloud then. "I promise I'll live my life for two." Unfortunately, finding a name wasn't enough. Finding the donor's relatives turned out to be quite a quest. Michael had to hire a private investigator to find out that the boy was from an orphanage. He had no parents or other relatives. The apartment was state-owned and had been given to the state after the death of the young man. But Michael found out that his donor was going to get married. Only the wedding did not take place. The groom had passed away a month before the important event. What made the situation even more tragic? So the guy decided to find out the bride's address. Michael felt he needed to talk to someone. He was too far gone to stop. That's how he found out the bride's name was Kathy. That's where Michael headed. The navigator led him to a village. From there, kind people showed him the way. It turned out that the donor's bride's house was in a dacha community on its very outskirts. The dilapidated building was situated on a plot of land near a dense forest. As Michael stepped out of the car, he was confused and even embarrassed. He took out his smartphone to check the address again. There were no signs on the house, but the map told him it was in the right place. The house looked completely abandoned. It was surrounded by a patch of tall grass. The gate of the low fence was open, and in some places it had been torn down. Michael decided to follow the path to the house, but no sooner had he reached the front door than it swung open from there. A young woman burst out crying. She was followed by a man, shouting drunkenly and menacingly, "Well, get out of here. Who needs you? You were thinking of pouring out moonshine. We live on it. You fool." The girl, whose eyes were full of tears, did not notice Michael and swung at him. Oh, she was frightened, raising her gaze to the unexpected guest. "Excuse me, please," said Michael, confused, but picked up the stranger so she wouldn't fall. Nothing. She shook her head, wiping away her tears. The girl was very pretty, despite her mussed hair and tear-soaked cheeks, green eyes, curved lashes. Her eyebrows were dark, her hair black, like thick tar. Her lips were plump and sensual. Michael's Betty bride had them as a result of surgical intervention, but the stranger clearly had her own naturally, as did the flat, thin nose. The line of her cheekbones. Michael caught himself staring at her. She charmed him at first sight. His heart froze in his chest, skipping a beat, and then it beat fast, fast, picking up the pace again, as if it recognized the brunette. Michael, on the other hand, put his palm to his chest, seriously afraid for his heart. He didn't need such worries, and the nature of them was unclear. The girl was beautiful and also crying. Any man would want to protect such a girl, to feel like a knight. But Michael understood that this was not the main reason for his anxiety. The girl, unaware of Michael's confusion with her sleeve, wiped away her tears. Before she looked at the stranger, however, barely her eyes focused on the brunette's face, she became numb. Her face, flushed from sobbing and running, instantly lost color, becoming pale as a sheet. "My God," she babbled. The girl clutched at the cross hanging from her breast. "My God, it cannot be." She took a step backward on shaky legs, and then, as if she'd changed her mind, she leaned toward Michael again. The thin, graceful hand slid its fingers over the silver chain, reached for the face of the frozen brunette in indecision. The next moment, her thick lashes fluttered like the wings of a butterfly. The beautiful eyes rolled back, and her body began to sink to the floor, as if in slow motion. Michael, not understanding what was happening, picked up the girl in his arms. "What is the matter with you?" Frightened, he asked, but consciousness had already left the stranger. Hearing other people's conversations, an older man came out of the house onto the porch. He was holding an almost finished bottle of beer in his hand, which he had touched on his way out into the air. "What do you think you're doing?" barked. He swayed. What did the creep do? Michael understood how the situation looked from the outside, but he could not give a sensible answer as to why he was holding an unconscious girl in his arms, and he doubted that the drunken man would be able to understand his words. Not the kind of meeting I expected at my donor's house, the man said mentally. In fact, I didn't know what to expect at all. He picked the girl up in his arms. With amazement, he noticed what he called the brunette. The man was as light as a feather. She fainted. I did nothing, he informed the owner of the house, involuntarily making excuses. Show me where I can put her. We should call an ambulance. He grudgingly clucked his tongue, but still he made room to let the stranger into the house, dragging him into the room. There's a couch in there, shouted the man, scratching his stomach. It wasn't until Michael carried out the instruction with the utmost care, laying the frail girl on the old red-headed couch, that he turned to the old man. He furrowed his brow and squinted myopically, then recoiled from Michael like a plague. His gait, shaky from the alcohol he had drunk, became even more unsteady. Michael watched in bewilderment as the second man in the last 5 minutes began to shake at the sight of him like a leaf in the wind. The bottle fell out of the older man's hands, its contents spilling out onto the carpet. Dibs, dibs. The man cried out with superstitious consternation, looking at Michael. You've come for me. For me what? The landlord trembled, his teeth chattering with a drumbeat. He spoke with pauses, as if he had to squeeze the words out of him. Holy, 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 muttered the man, raising his trembling hand and crossing himself. Why did you come back? Why did you come back? Do you think I am hurting her? No, I do not. It's just that we need the money. I took care of her. I didn't take care of your baby either, I swear. I swear, Jacob. Michael shook his head with a frown. Have you been drinking yourself to death, old man? Dazed, Michael whispered, adding louder. Get a grip, please. Give me the normal address of the house so I can call a doctor. He tried to reassure the man at the same time, pulling out his cell phone to call for help for the girl. But he did not get an answer from the old man. At one point, the owner of the house dropped to his knees and began to recite either the Lord's Prayer or some other prayer. Michael never understood. What a madhouse, he commented. This whole situation was very disconcerting. Michael was already dialing the number of the ambulance to call the paramedics, at least to explain to them the way. He realized that doctors were needed here. Psychiatrists, too, it seemed. But no sooner had he pressed the call button than the springs on the couch. They creaked, first briefly, and then long. In tone with them came the faintly audible moan of a girl. Michael turned toward her, immediately running up to the bed. He felt a new wave of concern for the unfamiliar brunette. Are you okay? He asked, realizing she had come to her senses. She blinked rapidly, as if she were adjusting to the artificial light of the room, then focused her gaze on the face above her. Her lips trembled softly. She slowly raised her dainty hand and held it out to Michael's face. He watched spellbound as the stranger's fingers touched his cheek. At first, she barely touched the man's skin with her fingertips and pulled her hand back hastily, as if she'd been burned. Her gaze grew tense. A crease appeared between her eyebrow line, and the brunette swallowed, trying again to touch. This time, she was bolder. Her hand rested on Michael's cheek, gliding over it with the greatest tenderness. With her thumb, she stroked him, for the touch was so pleasant that Michael could barely keep from covering his eyes and giving into it, like a cat petted by its mistress. He roused himself, pulling himself together. Madness must be contagious, so I caught it from these strange people, some kind of airborne disease. Mentally, Michael muttered, I can't believe it. The girl whispered. There were tears in her eyes again. Like two precious jewels, she barely blinked, and they flew from her lashes. They slid down her chin, leaving wet traces on her delicate skin. Michael touched her gently with his palm, moving her away from his face. when he tried to withdraw his hand from the stranger's fingers. However, the stranger would not allow it. She clutched at it, squeezing his hand with insistent gentleness. "Are you confusing me with someone else?" Michael spoke warmly, worried about the girl and her condition. "Let me call you a doctor, okay? You will get help." The girl frowned, put her straight eyebrows together, and shook her head. Stubbornly, she began to scrutinize the face of the man frozen in front of her. "No, but how is that possible?" The brunette whispered, barely audible. "You look too much like that. Jacob's face is the same." Hearing the familiar name, Michael nodded. "Yes, Jacob. I came here because of him. Jacob. He informed me. Tell me, your name is Kathy, right?" The girl held up her hand. She jumped up sharply on the couch, assuming a sitting position. "Yes," she nodded hesitantly. "Jacob hadn't told me about you. That's why I was so shocked. I thought he didn't have any relatives. He was from an orphanage." Michael sighed, shook his head. "He wasn't. I'm not related to him." He froze in indecision. He thought this wasn't the best time to admit that the heart of this woman's fiancé was beating in his chest. She seemed a little crazy to him. The brunette's eyebrows crept upward, hiding behind her bangs, and like a screen. Her face stretched, and an undecided smile appeared on her lips. "Are you sure?" she asked, as if it were Michael and not her. Acted like an escaped mental patient. Then the girl pulled out her phone. Opening the gallery, she found a picture and held it out to Michael. "Could there be such a coincidence?" she asked, still looking at the man with disbelief. Michael picked up someone else's smartphone and peered at the screen. He was dumbfounded to see a picture of himself. Or rather, the face was his, but there was someone else in the picture. It was someone else, hugging Kathy around the waist and smiling broadly. Her dark hair was disheveled, which Michael didn't allow himself, and he kept combing it back. The brown eyes looked like they were laughing. The neck of a guitar in a black case looked out from behind him. Without asking permission, Michael flipped through the pictures on the other man's phone. There were a lot of pictures of men with his face. "How is that possible?" Michael muttered, feeling himself close to insanity. He pulled his shirt collar away from his throat, swallowing the lump on his forehead and temples. The men's sweat came out sharply. "I thought you were Jacob," quietly the girl admitted, keeping her eyes on him. She pulled her knees up toward her, wrapping her arms around them. Now her behavior did not seem strange to Michael. On the contrary, she was quite quick to cope with the shock. Considering the situation, what would he have done if he had seen a dead relative or loved one quite awake and alive? So, a run-in for a visit. Of course, fainting would have been less. What could have happened? "I don't understand what's going on." Michael finally let it out, tearing his eyes away from another picture. And looking at Kathy, "I'll try to figure it out. Just tell me now. It's all right." The girl didn't have time to answer. The next second, Michael saw her eyes go wide. With horror, she opened her mouth to scream loudly and worriedly somewhere behind his back. "No, don't. Stop." Michael wanted to turn around to see what the danger was. What had frightened Kathy so? But he didn't have time. The next moment, something heavy dropped on his head. The man felt a sharp, dull pain, and then everything before his eyes went dark. He could still see Kathy's face as she slowly cried. And then there was total darkness. When Michael opened his eyes, he groaned. Not from pain or discomfort, but from frustration. "Am I really in the hospital again?" he muttered, staring at the walls of the room. It was becoming a bad habit. "I'd better get myself a private room, since I'm a regular here." He stood up from the bed, feeling the bandages on his head. He touched the bandage with his fingers, but felt no great pain. Michael remembered being in the strange house, and then felt the impact. He remembered the old man too. Surely the old drunkard had decided not to wait for God's help, whom he desperately cried out to deal with the evil one in his own way. If a ghoul came out of his grave, he should arrange for a ride back. Michael didn't even know whether to condemn the unfamiliar old man. After all, he too had met a ghost. Although he would have preferred to be doused with holy water or salted, he would have preferred to be pelted with holy water or salt to begin with, rather than beaten with a truncheon or whatever it was that hit him. The answer to the question of where the wound on the back of his head had come from came within 10 minutes. A nurse looked in and noticed that the patient had regained consciousness, so she called the doctor. "You were hit on the head with a bottle," he explained. "It's a good thing you didn't hit him with a bottle and an empty one. So you got away with a bruise and a mild concussion. But given your peculiarity, that kind of emotional turmoil can have a negative impact on your health. I want to support you in the hospital and monitor your condition." Michael just sighed heavily. He did not argue with the doctor. "What happened to the Kathy girl and the man?" he asked the doctor. "The girl called an ambulance. The man was taken to the station. What happened next?" "I don't know," answered the doctor. "They are probably waiting for you to testify." The police did come to the ward, demanding an explanation from Michael. However, the guy did not press charges against the drunken old man. He decided that he would deal with everything that had happened himself first. For the next few days, Michael was at a loss, trying to understand why his donor looked like a twin brother or a clone. It wasn't until he got out of the hospital that he was able to lift the veil of mystery. Michael arrived at his parents' house because he didn't want to ask such strange questions over the phone. When they heard his story, they looked at each other. Michael's mother looked at her son with consternation. She stretched out her hands and squeezed his fingers. "We have something important to tell you. I was hoping we'd never bring it up," the woman began, but fate had decided otherwise. Michael frowned as he looked at his parents. He was ready to hear that he had a twin brother, but his parents' story shocked him. "I don't know who this man was," Jacob said his mother at once. "However, I can't claim that you don't have a brother." "How is that?" "What do you mean?" "I don't understand." Mom squeezed his fingers tighter and looked up at her husband's face, searching for support and the right words. But Ethan sat with a stone face, expressing no emotion. The man seemed deeply lost in his own thoughts, and not with them at the moment. "Remember when you needed a blood donor? No one in our family came up?" asked the woman, softly. And waiting for her son to nod, she continued, "The thing is, we are not blood relatives, Michael. But before I tell you everything I want you to know, I've always thought of you as my son, my own, my favorite, my only son. There wasn't a second when I thought otherwise. What's more, Michael, I thought you were sent from above. You were our salvation and the gift of understanding." No, Michael didn't understand. He didn't understand anything of his mother's words. He saw how her face, adorned with a web of wrinkles that did not mar this noble woman's countenance at all, filled with sadness. He saw the tears glistening in her light blue eyes, ready to burst out. "But didn't you say that my illness was an inheritance from my grandfather?" The doctor said it might have been one of the causes, but it was just a coincidence. "Honey," softly explained his mother. "Go on, please," he asked, feeling that his own throat was cramping with excitement. He wanted water, but did not dare take his hands from his mother's grasp. "We were young when your father and I met. I got pregnant almost immediately after I met him. Of course, keeping the baby was out of the question. We had nothing. We ate empty pasta, not even butter. We took care of his mother. She was sometimes very sick. We lived in an old apartment and worked there. We had only a dream in youth. Ethan was taking the first steps toward the success he craved. However, when I admitted that I was expecting a child, he decided that stability was better than dreams. He promised to get married. He would take care of me and the baby, and said that he would hire me for a regular job with a stable schedule. Started looking for a job. Only I could see the longing with which he looked at the things we were going to create. Then I decided I wasn't ready to do that to the person I loved and our destiny. Not ready to take away from Ethan what he breathed, and not ready to become a mother just yet." "Did you get rid of the baby?" Michael asked straight out, seeing that the mother was having trouble finishing the story out loud. He had already figured out in his mind that he himself had been born when his parents were in their 30s, so he couldn't have been that child. But neither could Jacob. So there were still questions. The mother nodded, corrected the strand of gray hair that popped out from behind his ear, and put her palm down on her son's fingers again. This decision, however, was fateful. There was no money for an abortion at a good clinic. I won't give you the details. I was barely saved at the time. Since then, my health problems began, his mother admitted, looking down at the floor. When we got married, then we were successful, and we seemed to forget about that incident. We started thinking about the baby again. Now we could give our baby everything. He would be long awaited, a life of wealth and love. I reassured myself, saying I had done everything right. But after that, I couldn't get pregnant for a long time. When we got desperate, I finally saw the cherished 2 lines on the test. The woman smiled sadly, wistfully. She looked toward the kitchen sink, except I couldn't see the screen in front of me, nor the cup for my morning coffee. What had her husband left next to the sink? She looked deep into her past. Happiness did not last long. I had a miscarriage. Then there were 2 more attempts, and both ended the same way. The 3rd miscarriage was particularly difficult. I was late enough. I thought I was going to lose my mind. I decided that this was my punishment. A psychologist told me that I was exacerbating myself. I was tormented with remorse and guilt from the first child I did not give birth to. The doctor said it was a complication from a botched abortion. Whatever the reason, the fact remained. We couldn't have children. So you decided to take a child from an orphanage. Michael guessed, trying to put the puzzle together on his own. Took me in without knowing I had a brother. Was it possible that we were separated? The mother shook her head, surprising her son with this. We didn't adopt you in an orphanage. Michael, I told you that I sincerely believe that you were sent from above, as an attempt at redemption. At one point, I even believed that you were my unborn son. It was stupid, ridiculous. But at that point in my life, I was in such an abyss of despair that the thought saved me. My mother was silent for a moment, tidying up her memories to share them. Michael was silent this time too, finally confused and wanting to just know the truth. Like I said, the 3rd miscarriage happened late in my pregnancy. Before that, I went to church all the time, praying for forgiveness, for carrying at least 1 child. One winter day when I went to church, it was already dusk. I had barely entered the church grounds when I was terrified. A shadow swept along the side of me, rushing toward the gates of the church. It was a woman, strange, badly dressed. She shoved my shoulder to the side, hiding her face and trying to make her way toward the exit. The stranger clutched something to her chest and ran away without looking back. And I looked to where she was running from. The Christmas decorations were still there. People were bringing cookies and candy and fruit, leaving handouts. And I thought it was the poor girl wanting to take something for herself. She must have been hungry, but I didn't give it much thought. I went up to the church, put out candles, then wandered toward the parking lot. It was awfully cold outside the church fence. The frost was getting colder. There wasn't a soul around. And then I heard a strange sound. It scared me. After all, it's dark around here. But out of curiosity, I decided to approach the source of the noise. My mother frowned, remembering the moment. I couldn't see anything at first. It was dark. There was white snow lying around the snowdrifts, making my eyes somewhat cloudy. In addition, I felt bad. My stomach was starting to hurt. I looked at the figures that were on display for the congregation to celebrate Christmas. It was the famous scene in the stable when Jesus was born. Mary and Joseph bent over the little baby. A donkey, a sheep, and a cow were seated around him. I looked at Mary. I remembered the woman who was begging here. I felt sorry for her and for all those who come to the church hoping for help. I took some bills out of my wallet and decided to put them in with the other handouts. Only when I bent over, I gasped in fright. So that's how it turned out. As I looked at the baby manger, the pet feeder, I recoiled. There was a real live baby lying there. The mother faltered. The woman's lips quivered. She moved her lips as if she were whispering something before repeating it aloud. There was the child. He was already frozen because he had managed to wriggle out of the diapers and blankets. I looked at him in mute shock, not daring to take him in my arms, looked around, realizing that the baby must have a mother. But there was no one. Then I grabbed the baby, wrapped him up, unzipped my jacket, pressed it to my chest, covering it. The baby started making noises, touching me with its little hands. I quickly ran back to the church. I flew up the steps in seconds, but when I touched the doorknob, I didn't open the door. Michael saw my mother's hands begin to shake, and he squeezed them himself, hoping to reassure her. Tears streamed down her face. Ethan, who until then had been standing at the window, looking up at the sky, he turned to his wife. He took a step toward the table where his wife and son sat. He lowered himself heavily beside the woman. He put his hand on her shoulder. Encouragingly, she barely tilted her head toward his palm. The wife, accepting his support, sobbed. Then she spoke again. "I couldn't give it away," the woman admitted. "In my innermost self, I felt his little heart, your heart. Your heart beats in my chest, like a little bird colibri so quickly. So desperately I thought about how cruel it was to leave you here in the cold. After all, if I hadn't passed by morning, you would have frozen by now. Then I remembered that I had been so cruel to my own child. And then your fist clutched at my hair, you began to whimper. You were hungry, frozen, tired. My hand shook, but I held you tighter to me." As if to prove her point, my mother squeezed Michael's fingers hard. He listened to her in shock, recognizing his past. I turned and rushed to the car, looking around for fear of being yelled at or caught. When I arrived with you in my arms, Ethan was in shock. He said we should call the police in case the baby was stolen. However, I had already fallen in love with you. I had a miscarriage that night. Only this time we didn't tell anyone about it. We buried the baby and left you in his place. Everyone I knew was sure I was finally able to give birth. The doctors were told that I had given birth at home. It was becoming more and more popular during this period. I made up stories on the fly about giving birth in the bathtub, about being at one with nature, that it was this comfortable environment that helped me give birth for the third time. So you stayed with us. Son Michael exhaled heavily. This tragic story was seeping into his mind. Gradually, it interrupted in him, forcing him to accept new facts that his brain had ripped away. It's not easy to spend your whole life thinking your parents were related, and then to find out such shocking details. It turned out to be more than that, however. The mother continued. Who your birth parents are, I don't know. There were no other children there. But Ethan kept watching the news, afraid to see the story about the lost boy. That's when he came across a similar case. An infant boy had been abandoned in the same neighborhood the same night. He was found by a man who was taking out the trash. The baby's mother was not found, and the baby was taken to an orphanage. We thought it was a strange coincidence, but it's possible. Maybe I frightened the woman away, and she just didn't have time to leave the second baby at the church. Could it have been your blood brother who became your donor? Is that really possible? The mother, at a loss, looked at her son, then at her husband, and then turned her gaze back to Michael. No one present had an answer to this question. Michael decided, however, that he would surely find it. After a while, Michael again hired a private investigator of the same type that had helped him find his brother Kathy's fiancé. Within a week, the detective from the private office arrived with news. Jacob ended up in an orphanage just after he was born. I haven't found out all the circumstances yet, but I can tell you one thing. He looked for the right papers in a folder and nodded and continued. He was found by the garbage cans. It made the news in January. The child was sent to the hospital, from there to the orphanage. At first, everyone felt sorry for the baby, so adoptive parents were found almost immediately. Wealthy businessmen who had a marriage and a reputation to save. The man had been seen in suspicious scams, so the couple wanted to whitewash themselves. The detective showed Michael pictures of his brother's adoptive parents. What went wrong? Michael marveled. And Kathy said Jacob was in an orphanage, that he had no family. The detective nodded. This is the second part of the story, he said, pulling out some more pictures, this time with young Jacob. When the commotion around the infant subsided, our rich people realized that the baby wasn't what they wanted. They got their PR. As eyewitnesses say, there was constant conflict in the couple. At first, they hoped that the baby would reconcile them, help them regain not only public favor, but also love. However, it did not work out. The baby constantly cried, was sick a lot. In general, he behaved like a normal infant, which they were not prepared for. Instead of happiness, motherhood, and fatherhood, they got a headache. The couple ended up getting a scandalous divorce. Neither of them wanted to take responsibility for someone else's child. Both went abroad to different countries, leaving their child in an orphanage. The adoptive parents abandoned their son when he was 4 years old. In case you're wondering, they both went bankrupt. What happened to the mother that left you? I don't know. I can't find out. Here's the frustrated father who ended up going to jail for an economic crime. No need to find out. What good is it now? Brokenly, Michael said, looking at the pictures of his brother. My brother can't be brought back, and his fate can't be changed. We were both thrown away like garbage, except he was betrayed twice. He lived in an orphanage when I was with kind, loving parents. I got not only his family, but also his heart. That doesn't seem fair at all. The detective cast an inquiring glance at his client. Usually he remained professional to the last, but now he couldn't help himself, and he too was struck by the story of the two twins. I'm sorry, said the detective. Michael nodded hesitantly. Still looking at the pictures, they evoked strange feelings in his soul. It was as if he was looking at himself. There was a copy of him in the pictures, only there were no such moments in his past. Here he sits with his guitar and smiles at the photographer. And a fluffy red cat rubs himself at his feet. Here he is cuddling his friend. Later, Michael sat at the bar with his friend Liam, drinking scotch, while Michael drank plain water in a gulp. Today, Michael really wanted to drink something strong, but he didn't dare do that to his health, not after his brother had given him a piece of himself. I didn't even know I had a brother. The man exhaled, still in a state of shock. And now it's too late. Liam squinted at his comrade, shook his head. He tapped his friend on the shoulder. Leave it, Michael. There is no point in beating yourself up. Softly, he said. You could not have done anything because you did not know. It wasn't your fault. You were just luckier that night. And if you want to do something to thank your brother, understand that you have more responsibility now. You owe it to yourself to be happy for two people. You know what? Let's have with these words. Liam poured from his glass of whiskey into his mate's empty glass. The amber liquid filled it just a little, covering the bottom. Michael looked at him aloof. He lifted the glass with a toast, tipped the drink into himself with another, letting it burn his gut. Warmth spread inside, warming his chest. The friend next to me coughed and grabbed a piece of cheese off the saucer, dumping it into his mouth. Listen, what about his fiancée, Kathy? Have you seen her yet? Michael shook his head negatively, not sure what to say or how to show up either. I don't think she wants to see the face of her dead fiancé. But from your story, your face probably looks better than the face of the old man she lives with. That's her grandfather. Michael wrinkled his nose. He squeezed the glass, remembering with irritation the old man's face. More than once he thought of the girl running out of his house, the way he shouted after her. I want to help her with money or something, he admitted. That's right. Liam nodded. Another week passed, and Michael was still hesitant to return to Kathy's house. However, he did so after another piece of news from the detective. Your brother has a son, he reported during another meeting. Kathy gave birth to a child 6 months after Jacob's death. They were not officially married. The information passed us by. And then there is no certainty that it is his child. But he's sick. He is being treated now. The very next day, Michael arrived at the dacha village again. He knocked on the door, opened it Kathy. She recoiled again, seeing the face of her dead fiancé. You could see she was blushing and trying to come to her senses. You again, Michael nodded. You may come in. I have news. The girl let him in and sat him down at the table, offered tea and cookies. Michael thanked his hostess, but did not touch the food. He told her the story of the lost twins, about how Jacob's heart turned out to be the perfect donor organ. Even the doctors were amazed. No one knew it had belonged to his brother. Tell me, Kathy, do you have a child? It's Jacob's baby, Michael asked softly. Yes, we wanted to get married. We all saved up money for the wedding. I didn't want a big celebration, but he assured me the day had to be special. He said I deserved the best. Kathy smiled sadly. However, my pregnancy forced us to hurry. We applied to the wedding bureau. Right after I found out I was expecting a baby. I was so nervous at the time. I kept dreaming about the dress, all princess-like, but now I thought it wouldn't fit my belly. Jacob reassured me, telling me that the belly will not be visible in the small term. And then he died. Yes, then he died. It made me feel so bad. Nervous breakdowns, exhaustion. The doctors berated me terribly. They tried to convince me to pull myself together, but I couldn't. I fell into a depression. I felt like I was in quicksand. It was dragging me to the bottom. I gave birth to Mason, our son, prematurely. Because of this, because of me. The baby has a lot of health problems. Now my son is in the hospital. I have to be with him, but the bills have to be paid. So I work. I was hoping to sell Jacob's apartment and pay for my son's treatment. Except that we are nobody according to the documents. So I got kicked out of there. Now I'm here with my grandfather. Don't think. He's not as horrible as you think he is. He just drinks a lot. He makes moonshine for himself and the neighbors to sell. The girl averted her eyes, hiding her true feelings. His heart clenched in Michael's chest. He truly empathized with Kathy's grief. Don't worry about your son, he stated firmly. I will take care of him. About my brother I could not, but about my nephew I can. You do not owe us anything. The woman shook her head, looking away. I owe my brother. No amount of money would be enough to pay that debt categorically, Michael declared, and he kept his promise and took custody of Kathy and her child. Little Mason was placed in an excellent private hospital, and he made a quick recovery. After another month, Michael found Kathy a nice place to live, a 2-room apartment in the center with a spacious kitchen and a beautiful nursery. When Kathy first entered the apartment and saw the blue and white wallpaper with painted lighthouses, with adorable whales swimming between them, she couldn't hold back tears. The young woman turned to Michael, hugged him tightly, and said, "Thank you. I am so grateful to you." Michael smiled, openly, holding the petite brunette tightly to him. They'd grown very close over the past few months. They'd been on a first-name basis for a long time. Michael felt Kathy taking more and more space in his heart, except his own feelings confused him. At times he thought about Liam's words and wondered if they were his emotions or leftover from the previous owner of the heart. Whatever the answer, Michael dared not seek it. He couldn't do that to Betty. She was dreaming of marriage. She talked to him more and more about the wedding bureau. Now she was pulling on the company. While the groom was in rehab, Michael was very grateful to her, though he knew there was very little love in his feelings. He appreciated Betty, but more and more as a friend. While in Kathy he found a kindred spirit. The young girl turned out to be interesting, well-read. They could walk for hours, discussing books and the latest news of movies. Talking about plans for the future, Kathy listened with interest about the company. The men even suggested some good ideas. They both loved old black and white movies and world history with a passion for arguing about different topics, discussing famous people. Kathy always said what she thought without trying to please. He appreciated her for her sincerity. When Michael found out that Kathy had a college degree but was working in a cannery, He offered her a better secretarial position in his company. "My secretary has to go on maternity leave in a month and a half," he said. "Can you take her place? You'd better come out now so she can train you. And then we'll see what department we can get you into. What do you think?" "And I think I'll take any job that doesn't smell like sprats." Kathy laughed then. Her laughter rang like a silver bell, echoing in Michael's chest. So they decided. Kathy went to work at the farm and company. One day, Michael decided to pay her a visit to see how she felt in her new position and to examine the situation at her workplace. He intended to take back the reins of the company in the near future, a complicated operation. Then the story with his twin brother threw him off balance, but he was coming around. When he arrived at the office that day, he found neither Betty nor the deputy in attendance. Calling Kathy, he found out that the girl had been sent on some kind of errand. Michael made his way to his office with a pleasant feeling. After all, he liked to work. Of course, he wouldn't be plowing around like an immortal now. But Michael's eagerness to get down to business made his fingertips tingle. He had many new ideas. During his absence, he wanted to implement them. Michael walked around the office, poured food for the fish in the aquarium, then walked to his desk. He didn't find his things, but he wasn't embarrassed. If Betty occupied his office, she could create conveniences to her liking. The man picked up a file folder and flipped through it with interest. The contents, however, surprised him. According to the papers, Farman was once again offered to buy. For a long time, the firms had been competitors. The takeover offers began coming in about 10 years ago. Their amount was steadily increasing. Of course, both Ethan and his son Michael ignored these offers. Only Betty and Noah did not seem to agree with them. Suddenly, there was a sound outside the door, and Michael's hands trembled with surprise. He dropped his papers. The papers were scattered in a fan under the desk. Cursing, Michael bent down and picked them up. He had barely gotten under the desk when the office door swung open, letting Betty and Noah in. Michael recognized their cheerful voices. He wanted to get out of hiding right away to figure out the nature of the strange company sale documents. Except when he heard the bride's words, he froze and hushed. "Close the door." Giggling, said Betty, "The new secretary scares me. That silly girl is my fiance's girlfriend. Sometimes I think he put her on purpose to keep an eye on us." "Come on, Michael's as gullible as a house cat. He can't see past his own nose. Otherwise, he'd have found out long ago that his company and his fiancée were being stolen from him." Betty chuckled again. Noah, despite his dismissive tone, closed the door to the office. "Come here playfully," he muttered. Betty shrieked as the man picked her up in his arms and tossed her onto the leather couch in the office. There was a sound that was hard to confuse with anything else. The lovers kissed slowly, but surely a rage was brewing in Michael's chest. He, still sitting under the table, clutched the papers in his hands. "How are your wedding preparations going, by the way?" Noah asked, pulling away from the moaning woman. "Now, Betty, if you don't become his lawful wedded wife, it won't work. He eats out of my hand, so it'll be all right. We didn't apply because he was sick. Then there was some idiotic Brazilian drama with his twin brother. I think the rush would have been suspicious. He was too upset. Frustrated, Betty admitted. However, it's all in the past now. I think I'll take Michael to the wedding agency in a couple of weeks. We'll get married and I can take half of his estate. On top of the company. You're mean." Noah remarked admiringly. "I love you." "No, I'm not wicked, and I earned it all," Betty declared. "In fact, I took care of him while he was dying in there with his heart. Although, if he'd have flipped out then, it would have been less of a problem. I'd have played the hopeless widow, and his old folks would have kept me company. Could they have made a baby with you? And they would have been told it was their grandchild." The lovers laughed again. The temptation to appear before mean people and see the consternation and shock on their faces was great. But Michael decided that revenge should be served cold. He picked up his phone and texted Kathy. "Kathy, get Betty and Noah out of my office. They must leave the floor now. Fortunately, Kathy didn't demand an explanation. The girl, she was understanding and apparently determined, because within a couple of minutes, the man heard the sound of the fire alarm. The sensor in the room went off, flooding the room with water. Betty shrieked, Noah cursed. They jumped up from the couch, discussing as they went what might have happened. Michael waited for the couple to leave the office and ran downstairs to find out from the guards what had happened. Then he climbed out from behind the desk and rushed away from the office. At the door, he ran into Kathy. She was clothed, green eyes wide open. Michael, she exclaimed, wiping the water from her face. I didn't know what to do. Get the lighter and run away. It was the first thing I thought of. Despite his anger, Michael laughed in surprise. The sight of a disheveled and wet Kathy made him relax. The idea of knocking on the door and calling them somewhere didn't occur to you. He glared, choking back a laugh. Kathy looked at him in surprise, as if amazed that she hadn't thought of it herself. No, she did. She was embarrassed, but immediately exclaimed, but it was so effective, wasn't it? The alarm was finally turned off. The guards must have realized there was no fire, and the fire system malfunctioned. Michael looked toward the elevator and the stairs that led to the office floor. Betty and Noah were probably on their way back. He glanced at the bewildered Kathy. An unexpected thought occurred to Michael. He realized what he wanted and how he could get back at Betty and Noah. Kathy, do you want to marry me? He blurted out. The girl, who had been trying to straighten her hair, froze and looked at him. She blinked in amazement and said, Michael, there was no fire. You weren't breathing carbon monoxide. She smiled, but her smile was confused. No, I'm sorry. I mean a fake marriage. Michael corrected himself, though his heart gave a treacherous thud, as if disappointed in the remark. I need someone I can trust, Kathy. He briefly explained the situation to her. The girl shook her head, regarding his idea as delusional. It's about as delusional as setting off the fire alarm to get your boss out of his office. Michael snorted, slyly looking at the woman. Kathy's cheeks flushed. I was helping out a friend, not my boss, she said grudgingly. Michael's chest felt good again. Fortunately, it didn't take long to convince Kathy to help his friend again. The young men applied to a wedding agency. Michael paid to have them married within a week. At the same time, he returned unannounced to the company office and found Sam in his place. There was a look of surprise on Noah's face, but he quickly suppressed it with a big smile. My friend, he exclaimed, rising from his desk. What are you doing here? Come to see us. Michael grinned. You've warmed my seat, I see. He nodded at his chair. Comfortable. Noah wasn't confused, waving his hands in the air that you just weren't respectable enough to meet people in my office. It's more conducive to making good business deals. Quickly, he found himself. Michael nodded in agreement. Slowly, under Noah's gaze, he made his way to the aquarium, picked up the food again, and poured it over the fish, watching the scolari and guppies swim for treats. Suddenly, Betty burst into the office. Clinking her heels, she smiled broadly, looking at Noah. And without noticing Michael, she exclaimed, hello, darling. He made a frightened look on his face. He looked away from the aquarium. Betty frowned, turned around, and turned dramatically pale. Hello, my favorite, she repeated, rushing toward Michael. I heard your voice and immediately ran to the woman hung on him, but he recoiled in disgust. Betty, leave this circus alone, please. I come to you with news. He shook his palm off the remains of the fish food, sending crumbs into the water. Betty stepped from foot to foot in utter confusion. I've heard rumors that the company my father built from the ground up is about to be sold, he said in an icy tone. There was an oppressive silence in the office. Noah was the first to cope with the stupor with a theatrical laugh. And you believe the rumors? Surely competitors must be spreading it to sink us, Michael. Don't tell me you ran here because of ridiculous gossip. Calm down. Your company is in good hands. You're right. It is in good hands, Michael nodded. Noah wanted to say something, but another character, Kathy, appeared on the scene. She burst in like a little whirlwind. Everyone looked at the young woman. Michael involuntarily admired her, thinking how beautiful Kathy was. The grief was gradually letting go of the woman. She smiled more and more. She could spend a lot of time with her son. Knew he was well taken care of. Hope in the soul. And Michael's care allowed this flower of ours to bloom again and open its delicate green-eyed petals. The colors of the malachite shone with delight. There was a beautiful pink blush on her cheeks. A smile played on her lips. Finding Michael's gaze, the brunette smiled even wider. "Michael," she exclaimed, rushing toward him. "The hospital just called. Mason, I can take him home. He's all right. He'll be all right now." "That's wonderful news," he exclaimed back, picking her up in his arms. She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck in the corner of her eyes, tears glistening this time with happiness. Not everyone shared the couple's glee, however. Betty blushed and then covered herself in white spots. "What's this?" "Go away, we're talking here," she barked incredulously, turning to Kathy. "What do you think you're doing? Why are you throwing yourself at someone else's fiancé? Michael, is that normal? Would you not talk to her like that?" Michael's advice, taking his time to let Kathy off his back. His arm held the girl's waist, which didn't escape Betty's gaze. "Why was that?" "Because you took pity on her and took her in like a mongrel." Betty got mad. Only she's still a secretary, the lowest link in the chain of this company. "I'm sick and tired of your cannibalism. So is your charity." Michael couldn't help smiling, which infuriated Betty even more, and his subsequent words shocked both lovers. "You're talking to my lawfully wedded wife, Betty, Kathy," he reported. The big news that had the effect of exploding a bomb. Betty recoiled, retreating 2 steps back, almost tangled in her heels. "What the hell are you talking about?" She exhaled frantically. "It's not bullshit. We're married now. The company belongs to Kathy now, and so do I. What about you? I've decided I just can't do bad things to you. Betty, you've done so much for me. I don't want you to tie your life to someone you don't love for some money." He shook his head. "What are you talking about?" Betty, clenching her fists. "But you're in love with Noah," he explained, nodding at the dazed Noah. "What's more, you guys deserve each other. You're equally vile and mean-spirited. So I wish you all the best, but as far away from me and my company as possible. You're both fired. The order has already been given and signed." "You can't do this to me," Betty screamed hysterically. "You? I took care of you like one takes care of a good purse," said the man with contempt, looking at his ex-fiancée. "You know, Betty, I can't even figure out which pisses me off more, that you betrayed me or that you wanted to get rid of my father's company. You knew how much she meant to me, and yet you made a deal anyway. Or maybe that's the reason you flipped out. Woman, you were raving about your company and didn't even pay attention to me. And you decided the best way to win back my favor was to have sex with the deputy." Michael raised his eyebrows, unable to hold back a nervous chuckle. "Betty, calm down. You lost. So get your stuff and vacate the office." But she wouldn't listen to him. It was as if Betty had lost her mind, grabbing the statuette from the table and screaming it was all you. "You told him about the sale. You sniffed it out." She threw herself at Kathy. The girl was so astonished that she didn't even think about ducking. She froze in place, looking at Betty. Michael proved to be quick. He backed up behind his spouse, so the statue landed on his shoulder. Grabbing Betty and snatching the statuette out of her hands, Michael pushed the blonde away, breathing hard with indignation. "Betty, if you don't leave, the police will escort you out themselves," he promised. "Noah, that goes for you too." The lovers were forced to leave the office, slamming the door behind them. Michael followed them with a gloomy look and turned to Kathy. Looking up into her face, he carefully asked her how scared you were. With a blink, the girl shrugged her thin shoulders. "To be honest, I didn't have time to be scared for you. I didn't realize what she had in her hands. I thought if you got hit in the head again, "You wouldn't get away with a concussion," she admitted. Michael suddenly had a strong urge to let her touch his face with her fingers. Like the first time they'd met, his eyes slid over Kathy's pale pink lips. In that moment, he didn't care whose feelings were tearing at his chest. He realized that he simply couldn't contain them anymore and had to let his emotions run wild. Michael leaned in slowly, as if to let Kathy pull away, but she didn't. The brunette's eyelids dropped, and she leaned forward, allowing the man to touch her lips. The kiss was tender, long-awaited, and full of a kind of relief, as if a weight had abruptly fallen from their shoulders, as if wings had grown and they could fly. "Strange," he laughed. "We are already married, and I kissed you for the first time." Kathy smiled too. Embarrassed by this turn, she hid her face in his chest, letting him press her against him. The girl could hear her heart beating fast and happy in her spouse's chest. 5 years had passed since Michael and Kathy had been married. True, the wedding had to be reenacted. Michael decided that Kathy should have the dress she had dreamed of. He fulfilled his beloved wife's every wish. Their son Mason was healthy, even though he was monitored by doctors. The couple also have a 1-year-old daughter growing up. Michael, as he had promised, lived for 2, for himself and for his brother. Over time, he began to notice what Liam was talking about. The man's tastes and habits were indeed changing. At times, he remembered something he couldn't have known. He began to like detectives, though previously he had only read memoirs and biographies. His brother happened to have an entire collection of books by Agatha Christie, Arthur Conan Doyle, and James Hadley Chase. Then one night, Michael realized that he was dying to strum his guitar, even though he couldn't play. His brother, on the other hand, played the game perfectly. At such moments, he felt as if his brother were reaching out to him, waving, reminding him of himself. However, he was not forgotten by the doctors, who said that Michael would live with a new heart for 12 to 15 years. They weren't so sure anymore. The organ was so fit that the prognosis became surprisingly optimistic and even fantastic. It was just a miracle. Of course, Michael had always believed that life had been unfair to his own brother. Except he couldn't fix it, but he could make a better life for the woman he loved and his child. And Michael also hoped that part of his brother's soul was still in his chest, which meant he was still alive. He might look at the world through his twin brother's eyes and breathe through his lungs, but he loves with his heart.